Hi folks, as I promised in the previous episode, which I've edited by now but haven't uploaded yet, so you're probably gonna see these quite closely one after another appear on YouTube. What I promised to show you or explain to you is why these SunRay thin clients or thin clients in general never got the attention you'd expect when you saw people see these the first time and their reaction when they first saw people moving a desktop session from one thin client to the other within a second, just carrying around a smart card. Now, there are a number of reasons. First, we have the three important things to keep in mind when you build IT systems. First one of those is performance or efficiency, which is performance per buck, bang per buck if you like, for whatever definition of bang suits your particular purposes. Now, as I explained before, these have 100 megabit Ethernet interfaces from back at a time when most desktops still had 10 megabits. And they really needed the network bandwidth. I mean, this is reasonably fast because I've chosen a desktop background which compresses nicely and gets transmitted fast. If I chose a different one, or if I was using there's an application I can show you. The application that I found that is quite, well, where you actually can notice this is Mahjong, because the way the tiles are done, it doesn't compress all that well. And you see, redrawing that screen takes a moment. But admittedly, I've cheated because I've hooked things up to a 10 megabit switch rather than the 100 megabits they could actually cope with. But if you use some of the desktop backgrounds included, it really gets painful. So performance and cost efficiency is a problem. With a network, because you needed network components that could do 100 megabits, which were kind of expensive at that time. And you also, and that was when things could get really ugly, you needed 100 megabit capable cabling in your building. If you had to replace the cables in an existing building, that's really an expensive thing to do. So that was one of the reasons why people were kind of reluctant to put these to work, at least in some environments. Similar situation is on the server side, which happens to be here, with the screen server already kicking in. On the server side, performance is a more tricky thing. First off, back in those days, the Unix world was just starting to accept the fact that it was actually more efficient to use large numbers of fairly low power machines, basically like desktop PCs, workstations, whatever you call them, rather than the big servers. When I was the age where I was more interested in shitting my diapers again, rather than working with computers, there was an old adage saying, if you spend twice as much money on a computer, you get 4 times as much computational power out of these. That was up to in the 80s, but that drastically changed basically with the arrival of the first personal computers. Not IBM PCs, but before, with things like the Apple II, you probably know, or some old CPM machines like the Zenith Z100 that was the first real computer I got used to, well, after the VIC-20. And at that time, letting go of this idea, we need a computer as big as possible because we get the most value for our money, which was the reason why back all the way into the 80s, universities frequently had all their faculties join their budgets to buy one big computer. Sometimes multiple universities actually did that, to buy one bigger machine. That actually change, and quite drastically so. But these things need a fairly big server, so they are not exactly cost efficient. It can kind of work if most of the time people do things that need little CPU power, because then you'd have law of big numbers and whatnot. You'd have some pretty constant workload on there, and whoever was working on these machines actually got quite large share of the power available. But if people were doing things that needed a constant amount of performance, or a pretty constant had pretty constant resource requirements, for example, just to really go over the top, if people were using these for video editing, it simply wouldn't have worked. It would have made the servers hideously expensive, and 100 megabits and even gigabit Ethernet way too slow, by the way. So with regard to performance, these things were kind of missing the problem or going the wrong way even when they were released. Another thing, again, reliability, both sides. The network goes down or the server goes down. It's not like the average Windows for workgroups, Windows 95, maybe Windows 98 PC, where you could still work locally. When the server or the network was down, it was extended coffee break for everybody, except for you if you had to fix things so people could work again. So this is about reliability, and having single points of failure or putting exceedingly high requirements on reliability on particular components is generally something you try to avoid if you can when you build IT systems or environments. Can't do that with these. When the network goes down, okay, you can have spanning tree and whatnot, and it only affects the switch. It only affects users if there's a switch involved where the machines are directly connected to. So you can kind of deal with this on the network side using spanning tree or dynamic routing, whichever. But on the server side crashes, you lose the sessions. If you have to shut down for maintenance purposes, you'd have to log out everybody on that machine before you could do whatever and then bring it up. So that wasn't exactly nice. And it's still a problem these days with a lot of things which are built without understanding of these things. So we have performance or efficiency, which is performance per buck. We've had reliability, and the number 3 fundamental design principle is longevity. How long can you use a given system? With Windows PCs at that time, everybody assumed that 2 years on they'll be replaced by something faster, more capable to do things that aren't even imaginable today, but 2 years from now they are. And well, frequently enough with a Windows version that just made sure that a lot of the additional power you had in the new machines was actually gobbled up by the operating system again. But still, buying a new machine after 2 years at that time actually made sense. But it was a matter of numbers. You need a new machine every 2 years, so basically the amount of money you spend per year is half the initial cost, because it's over 2 years. Now, thin clients, on the other hand, were meant to last and to stay. You'd buy these and expect them to work at least 5, maybe 10 years, which is cool. Less electronic waste and whatnot, but you'd only do that if you were reasonably confident that the manufacturer would actually support these for as long. Sun Microsystems, no matter what some people, especially some special Linux fanboys, say, did a pretty good job at giving you long-term support for your hardware. They really put an effort into it. However, you still had to trust them. And if you did, a couple of years ago, you're now pretty much screwed, because it's no longer Sun Microsystems, it's Oracle now. Oracle discontinued these. Just to help me make this point, they even discontinued the smart cards, which is just basically telling people what they think of customers. And to really get the point across, from what I found on the web, people asked Oracle, okay, with these cards discontinued, what did you actually use there? Can we get anything else we can use with these machines from some other manufacturer, buy directly from whatever manufacturer? Oracle apparently never bothered to answer that question. They really want these things gone, which is bad news if you have bought them like successor models, like 2-3 years ago, and had planned to use them for 10 years, which basically makes sense. So those are the three big ones. And when it comes to long-term things, vendor lock-in is always dangerous. In the PC world, well, unless you use Linux FreeBSD, NetBSD, OpenBSD, OpenSolaris, whatever, but you use Windows, you basically have this problem with Microsoft, which is bad enough. But at least you can switch, and with Intel to some degree, but you can switch between different hardware manufacturers. And it doesn't have to be Intel, it could be AMD as well. So that's why people were a bit afraid of these as well. So those are the three big ones when you build a system. It's, again, performance, efficiency, it's reliability, and it's expected lifetime, basically. And it helps to keep these things in mind, and it also helps if you accept that these are pretty much the same things management thinks about, worries about. They use different words for it, but if you establish some sort of understanding that you're actually talking about the same thing, it makes life a lot easier for both of you. However, there's still another thing, and this is special to thin clients. While the other stuff was all pretty much generic IT architecture stuff, with an example of thin clients, but there's also something with thin clients. They are largely out of date. We have better solutions for a lot of use cases than taking a smart card from one machine to another. Still love to do this, but still, its problem is, what if I go somewhere where there's no machine to stick it into? In a lot of cases these days, it makes more sense to equip people with some kind of tablet or so. Basically a personal computer. We don't have to worry about performance or some people affecting the performance for everybody else, and take that to wherever you want. You're not restricted to wherever you installed thin clients before. You're possibly not even restricted to staying within the reach of your local network, even if it's wireless. And the only reason for this to still be interesting in some scenarios is these are lighter and cheaper and easier to carry around than a tablet. But that only works if you only use it at certain locations where you've installed a thin client beforehand. So these days thin clients are pretty much obsolete, except in very few cases, because we have better solutions. And with what I've only read about, I haven't seen any of those yet, but with the idea of having a smartphone with some sort of dock, cradle, whatever you want to call it, attached to mouse, keyboard, display, it's basically, okay, a smartphone is slightly bigger than a smart card, but it solves a lot of problems we've had thin clients. Except for the one remaining thing, but even there a lot of things have changed, which is that back when these things became popular, managing a large number of Unix machines, or pretty much any machines, was a real pain in the ass. Microsoft had a bit of a head start with their domain controller concept, but it wasn't exactly nice either. Windows machines needed some bit of individual attention, and still do these days. But in the Unix world, where the original thing was we have one big machine, like in the mainframe world, having more and more machines was actually a pain to manage. At university where I started off on a VT100 compatible terminal, serial terminal on one central machine, and after I got my, well, what would that be, equivalent of a bachelor, something like that, degree, we actually got diskless workstations, Sun SLC, ELC machines running SunOS at that time rather than Solaris. And they were much nicer because you got plenty of performance. You've actually had a huge amount of memory, like 16 or 24 megabytes of RAM on the SLC and ELC respectively. And you needed that because as soon as these things started swapping across the 10 megabit network we had at that time, it wasn't just end of the day for you, but for pretty much everybody else on this network segment. But they had one huge advantage. You could manage them on the central NFS server. And people at Dortmund University knew how to do this, so basically what you'd use was shell scripts, M4 template files, and make files to deal with all the machines you had. Worked reasonably well, but relied on the fact that there were no local disks. These were diskless machines. With thin clients we got pretty much the same, only better, because it made things easy. You just managed the server. You wouldn't bother with thin clients except allowing certain clients to connect to wherever, but you're pretty much limited to managing the server where everybody was working on. Similar thing with X terminals. However, this centralized approach isn't cheap, and we got to the point that we had to manage large numbers of machines. In the late 90s we basically had two tools for that. One was for an early version of CF engine, which is still around these days, and that had a number of nice features, but it had one drawback. The way it worked back then, I don't even know how it does these days because I don't use it anymore, was that it had a set of configuration files, and to deploy it you just copy the configuration as is to all the clients, and then told the clients, now generate your particular configuration. Made sense performance-wise, but had one drawback. If you wanted to manage SSH host keys or SSL certificates for web servers, which were not supposed to be copied to all machines for security reasons, obviously, then it was just not a tool to use. The alternative we had was a tool called rdist, which basically synchronized files, kind of similar to rsync, except that it didn't use this fancy make an algorithm to minimize the network traffic. It just, once it figured out this file has changed, it copy it entirely. But it had one feature rsync, to my knowledge, doesn't have. You could say, okay, if any of these files here change, then run so-and-so program. So for example, if on a machine sendmail CF changed, you just restart sendmail. Was cool in a way, was really helpful. I've had at least one fairly large project where I actually used this to clean up a distributed installation, 40 locations, a lot of them only connected through ISDN leased lines in 64 kilobits per second. And they had been set up years before using a central template, but afterwards had been managed individually, so things had drifted apart. And my job, among other things, was to clean that up again, and Artist was a really useful tool for the job. But it was still dealing with files only, and it required people to be familiar with tools that were more from the software development side, kind of like this DevOps stuff that's all the hype these days, which were makefiles to run everything, which were, well, shell scripts for templates maybe, or preferably M4. But sometimes you actually had to use shell scripts, sometimes you preferred M4. And well, version control systems, which at that time was mostly RCS, maybe CVS at that time, and it was a bit of a pain. These days we have tools like Puppet, SaltStack, Ansible, Chef, newer versions of CF Engine. So we have way more tools to deal with the situation. So even from the system operations point of view, not just from the user's point of view, but also from the system operations point of view, thin clients make increasingly less sense. So all in all, these are antiques. Nice, hopefully sometime expensive antiques. And in case you wonder what I'm going to do with them, well, they draw too much power to keep running 24 hours around the clock. I'm decidedly unwilling to pay Oracle money for a product that they've discontinued and where they've shown that they don't give a something about people having problems trying to keep them up and running. So what I'm going to do is, I've got a nice glass case in my living room where they're going to go into. I'm going to keep them there, and maybe someday this open source Java server implementation for SunRay 2 will also support the SunRay 1, and then I'm happily going to reactivate them, put them somewhere where I don't keep them running around the clock, but you know, like, yeah, one's going to stay in my living room, I think, just to control my kind of stereo system, and the other one, bedroom. That's where I want things to be quiet, right? Something like that. I'll think of something, as long as I don't have to pay Oracle, of all things. Okay, so much about fundamental design principles of IT systems in general, and thin clients, and SunRay thin clients in particular. Hope you enjoyed this. If you want to discuss, it's at the BIVBlog forum, and hopefully I get this stuff edited and uploaded real soon. See you again. Bye.